It was a quiet summer morning in Frederick, Colorado. The sun rose over the Rocky Mountains, casting golden light on the peaceful Windham Hill neighborhood. Lawns were green, families just waking up, and the Watts family home looked like any other, a symbol of the American dream. But behind closed doors, something unimaginable had already happened. The silence hid a nightmare that would soon shatter the community's sense of safety. No one suspected the darkness lurking within those walls. This was the calm before a storm that would leave a permanent scar on the heart of America. In just hours, a horrifying secret would come to light. The perfect facade was about to crumble. On social media, Shanann Watts shared a life that looked perfect. Smiling family photos, loving posts, and joyful videos. To her followers, the Watts family was the picture of happiness. But beneath the surface, tension and secrets were growing. Chris Watts was drifting away, living a double life his wife never saw coming. The gap between their online image and reality widened every day. The illusion fooled everyone, friends, neighbors, even themselves. But the truth was about to break through the carefully curated perfection. The darkness behind the smiles would soon be exposed. Chris and Shanann Watts seemed like the perfect couple. 2 daughters, a new baby on the way, and a beautiful home. Chris was the quiet, devoted dad. Shanann, the energetic, loving mom. Their social media overflowed with family milestones and declarations of love. Friends and neighbors saw them as a model family, but the happiness was a fragile illusion. Behind the scenes, cracks were forming. The perfect image masked a growing darkness. Soon, the truth would shatter their carefully built world. While Shanann praised her husband online, their marriage was unraveling. Chris grew distant and withdrawn, the emotional gap widening. Financial stress and debt added to the strain. Shanann sensed something was wrong, confiding in friends about Chris's coldness. She hoped to save their marriage, but Chris was already living a double life. The perfect family was just an act. The disconnect was a ticking time bomb. The stage was set for tragedy. On August 13th, Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson grew worried when she couldn't reach her. Shanann had just returned from a trip, but now her phone was silent, unlike her. Nicole drove to the Watts house, found it eerily quiet, and saw Shanann's car still there. Chris claimed Shanann took the girls to a friend's house, but left behind her purse, phone, and keys. Nicole's instincts told her something was wrong. She called 911, reporting Shanann and her daughters missing. That call launched the investigation. Nicole's concern was the first alarm bell. Darkness was closing in. Police arrived at the Watts home for a wellness check. Chris met them, calm and detached, and let them inside. The house was spotless, no signs of struggle, but Shanann's essentials were left behind. Her phone, purse, and wedding ring were all still there. The children's rooms were tidy, their beds made. Chris's lack of emotion raised suspicions. The officer's body camera captured it all. The house felt frozen, as if the family had vanished. Something was terribly wrong behind the perfect facade. With no sign of his family, Chris Watts agreed to go to the police station for a formal interview. But first, he stood on his front porch and gave a now infamous television interview to a local news crew. With news cameras rolling, he pleaded for his family's safe return. He looked directly into the lens and spoke to his missing wife. "Shanann, Bella, Celeste," he said, his voice steady. "If you're out there, just come back. If somebody has her, just please bring her back. I need to see everybody. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without you." His words were what any desperate husband would say. However, his body language told a different story. To investigators and a watching public, his performance seemed rehearsed, his emotions manufactured. He smiled nervously at times, his arms folded defensively across his chest. There was a profound lack of genuine anguish in his eyes, a void where raw, desperate fear should have been. For a man whose pregnant wife and 2 small children had vanished, his demeanor was shockingly composed. He seemed to be playing the part of the distraught husband, but the performance was unconvincing. It was this chilling composure that first turned the tide of public opinion and police suspicion directly toward him. Later that day, neighbors provided police with crucial surveillance footage from their home security cameras. The footage from the previous night showed Shanann arriving home just as Nicole Atkinson had said. But the morning footage was far more revealing. It captured Chris Watts' truck, backed up into his driveway in the early hours of Monday morning. He was seen making several trips back and forth between the garage and his truck, loading items into the cab. This activity directly contradicted his initial story, that he had left for work while his family was still asleep inside the house. The timeline was beginning to crumble. The evidence was mounting piece by piece against the calm, cooperative husband. His story to Nicole that Shanann had taken the girls for a playdate was a lie. His placid television appeal felt hollow and insincere. And now, video evidence showed him engaged in suspicious activity at the exact time his family would have been discovered missing. The man who portrayed himself as a victim was quickly becoming the primary suspect. The investigation was no longer just about finding a missing mother and her children. It was about uncovering the truth of what really happened inside that silent house before the sun came up. In the critical first 48 hours of the investigation, the Frederick Police Department, now joined by agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, worked tirelessly to piece together a timeline. The case was officially a missing persons investigation, but a darker suspicion was beginning to take hold among detectives. They meticulously combed through the Watts home, searching for any clue, any trace of what might have happened to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Every drawer was opened, every surface dusted for prints, every digital device seized for forensic analysis. The quiet suburban home was now an active, sprawling crime scene, its silence replaced by the methodical hum of a major investigation. Chris Watts remained at the center of it all, a figure of intense focus. He continued to cooperate, answering every question thrown his way, but his narrative was beginning to show cracks. He spoke of a normal morning routine, of leaving for work while his family slept peacefully. But his story was inconsistent, shifting with each retelling. He couldn't provide a plausible explanation for why his wife, who was so attached to her phone and social media, would leave it behind. The small inconsistencies piled up, each one a tiny chip in the facade of the grieving husband. The man who claimed to have nothing to hide was beginning to look like he was hiding everything. Meanwhile, a massive search effort was underway. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement, fanning out across Frederick and the surrounding areas. Missing person posters with the smiling faces of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were plastered on storefronts and telephone poles. The story had exploded in the media, capturing national attention. The image of the beautiful, happy family, now vanished, was a haunting one. The public was captivated, desperate for a resolution, praying for a miracle. Every news report, every press conference was watched by millions, all asking the same question: where could they be? But inside the police station, the questions were different. Investigators were no longer just asking where the family was, but who was responsible for their disappearance. The focus was narrowing, tightening around the one person whose story didn't add up, whose emotional response felt disturbingly hollow. Chris Watts was asked to submit to a polygraph test, a lie detector, to help eliminate him as a suspect and clear the air. It was a standard procedure in a case like this, but for Chris, it would be a pivotal turning point. The machine, he was told, would reveal the truth. And the truth was something he could not afford to have revealed. On Wednesday, August 15th, 2 days after his family vanished, Chris Watts sat down for a polygraph examination. He was outwardly confident, maintaining his composure as the examiner strapped sensors to his body. The room was sterile and quiet, designed to amplify the pressure. The examiner began with a series of baseline questions before moving to the heart of the matter. Are you telling the truth about Shanann's disappearance? Do you know where your daughters are? Did you do something to cause your family to disappear? With each critical question, Chris answered no, his voice unwavering, his expression steady. But the needles on the machine told a very different story. The results were immediate and damning. The polygraph indicated extreme deception. On every single relevant question about his wife and daughters, Chris Watts had failed catastrophically. The examiner confronted him with the results, explaining that the test showed he was lying. This was the moment the investigation shifted irrevocably. The scientific data confirmed what the detective's instincts had been screaming all along. The calm, grieving husband was not a victim. He was a liar. The wall he had so carefully constructed around himself was about to come crashing down in spectacular fashion. Faced with the irrefutable results, Chris's demeanor began to change. The cool composure cracked, replaced by a flustered, defensive posture. He tried to offer explanations, suggesting his stress and anxiety had skewed the test. He claimed his secret affair, which he had finally admitted to investigators just before the test, was the reason for his deceptive answers. He was lying about his infidelity, he argued, not about harming his family. But the investigators were seasoned professionals. They had heard every excuse, every desperate attempt to deflect. They knew they had him cornered. The pressure was on, and it was relentless. The pre-test interview and the polygraph itself lasted for hours. Investigators used the results as a powerful lever, prying at the inconsistencies in his story, pushing him to abandon the charade. They told him they knew he was involved. They appealed to his conscience, urging him to tell them where his family was so they could be brought home. But Chris held firm, clinging to his crumbling narrative. The polygraph may have exposed his lies, but he was not yet ready to confess to the monstrous truth. That would require one more conversation, one more plea, this time from someone he thought he could fool, his own father. After the failed polygraph, investigators brought Chris's father, Ronnie Watts, into the interrogation room, hoping a direct appeal might break through. Ronnie pleaded with his son to tell the truth. It was this plea that broke him. Chris Watts finally began to talk, but the story he told was yet another calculated deception. He claimed that Shanann had strangled their 2 daughters after he asked for a separation. He said he killed Shanann in a rage after she murdered their children. He then admitted to taking the bodies to a remote oil site. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave and pushed his daughters' bodies through oil tank hatches. Investigators sensed it wasn't the whole truth, a self-serving lie to shift blame. This confession gave investigators the location of the bodies. The father, who had pleaded for his family's safe return, had confessed to disposing of their bodies. In the interrogation room, Chris Watts broke his silence, but what poured out was not the truth. He began to weave a new narrative, designed to cast himself as a victim of circumstance. He claimed that he had told Shanann that their marriage was over. This conversation, he alleged, was the spark that ignited an unimaginable tragedy, a tragedy he pinned squarely on his wife. In this first version of his confession, Chris painted a monstrous picture of Shanann. He told investigators that he saw Shanann strangling their daughter, Celeste. It was a story crafted with chilling detail, a desperate attempt to portray Shanann as a violent, unstable mother. He was trying to control the narrative one last time. According to this fabricated account, it was only after witnessing his wife murder their children that he flew into an uncontrollable rage. He described strangling Shanann in a fit of pure reactive fury. By admitting to this one act, he hoped to mitigate his culpability for the entire massacre. It was a lie designed to manipulate and to deceive. This confession provided investigators with the crucial information they needed to end the agonizing search. He admitted to loading his family's bodies into his work truck and driving them to a remote oil field. He gave them the location. As he spoke the words, the last glimmer of hope was extinguished. The search was over. Now the grim task of recovery would begin, and with it, the slow, painful process of dismantling Chris's final desperate lie. Armed with the confession, law enforcement raced to the desolate oil site. A recovery team began locating the bodies. They found Shanann first, buried in a shallow grave. The next phase revealed a level of depravity that shocked investigators. The focus turned to the 2 large oil tanks. Chris confessed to putting his daughter's bodies inside. The tanks were drained, and the small forms of Bella and Celeste were revealed. They had been pushed through the 8-inch hatches, an act that required brutal force. This contradicted Chris's story. Autopsy results delivered a final blow to Chris's narrative. Shanann had been strangled, slowly and deliberately. Bella and Celeste had died of smothering. The evidence pointed to a single conclusion. Chris Watts had acted alone. He had murdered his pregnant wife and daughters. His story was a fabrication. Chris's story began to fall apart. He was being exposed as a family annihilator. The monster was being unmasked. Months later from prison, Chris Watts confessed to the murders. The true sequence of events was more chilling than anyone imagined. It began while his wife lay sleeping beside him. He admitted to strangling Shanann to death. She was pregnant with their son Nico. His daughters, Bella and Celeste, woke up and saw him wrapping their mother's body. Bella asked, "What are you doing with mommy?" Chris put his daughters in the back seat, still alive, unaware they were being driven to their deaths. He smothered Celeste and dropped her body into an oil tank. Bella watched. She pleaded for her life. Her last words were, "Daddy, no." He smothered Bella and disposed of her body in the second tank. This was a cold, systematic execution. He did it to clear the way for a new life. The confession revealed a man devoid of empathy. Throughout his confession, Chris Watts recounted the horrific events with a disturbing lack of emotion. He described the murders of his wife and daughters with a flat, detached tone. There were no tears, no signs of profound grief or guilt. The investigators were struck by his chilling composure. This lack of remorse was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his confession. He saw his family as an obstacle to the new life he desired. He showed no understanding of the immense pain he had caused. He was a man operating in a moral vacuum. His calm demeanor during the television interviews was all an act. He was performing a role he thought was expected of him. He was a predator hiding in plain sight. The confession laid bare the soul of a true psychopath. The case of Chris Watts is a chilling study in the nature of evil. It was simply the final chapter in a story of ultimate betrayal. What motivated Chris Watts to murder his entire family? He wanted a new life, and his family was in the way. At the heart of it was a secret affair with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger. To Kessinger, Chris presented himself as a man on the verge of separation, trapped in a loveless marriage. He was crafting a new identity, laying the groundwork for a future without his family. Financial strain was another factor. Saddled with debt, he viewed his family as a financial liability. The desire for a clean slate became a deadly obsession. The romance and financial stress created a perfect storm. He saw a fork in the road and chose to obliterate the path he was on. He convinced himself that murder was a viable solution. The motive was, in essence, a desire for a fresh start. Chris Watts had become infatuated with his new girlfriend and the fantasy of a life with her. He viewed his family as an anchor holding him back. He had lost weight, started working out more, and was trying to reinvent himself. The murder of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and their unborn son Nico was his twisted way of shedding that old skin. Nicole Kessinger would later tell investigators that Chris had lied to her from the very beginning. When she saw the news reports of his missing family, she was confused and horrified. She quickly realized that the man she had been dating was not who he claimed to be, a pawn in his deadly game of deception and self-interest. He was willing to do the unthinkable to make that fantasy a reality. The level of premeditation was chilling, the price he was willing to pay for his own perceived happiness and freedom. Chris Watts chose to become a killer because he found the responsibilities of being a husband and father to be inconvenient. The case against Chris Watts was overwhelming. With his confession and the mountain of forensic evidence, a trial seemed inevitable. The world watched, expecting a long legal battle. However, on November 6th, Chris Watts shocked everyone by pleading guilty to all 9 charges against him. This included 5 counts of first-degree murder. He also pleaded guilty to unlawful termination of a pregnancy and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The decision to plead guilty was part of a deal that would spare him from a potential death sentence, at the request of Shanann's family. They did not want to endure the agony of a lengthy trial. For them, a life sentence without parole was a more certain form of justice. On November 19, 2018, the Weld County courtroom was packed for Chris Watts' sentencing hearing. It was, honestly, a day of profound sorrow and righteous anger. The hearing provided a platform for Shanann's family to confront the man who had stolen everything from them. One by one, they delivered powerful and heartbreaking victim impact statements. Shanann's father, Frank Rzucek, spoke first, his voice thick with emotion as he described the man he had once trusted as a son. He called Chris a heartless monster and lamented that he had to be locked up like an animal for what he had done to his precious daughter and granddaughters. Shanann's mother, Sandra Rzucek, spoke of the unbearable pain of losing her daughter and grandchildren, her grief just palpable in every word. But it was the statement from Shanann's brother, Frankie Rzucek, that captured the raw fury and devastation of the family. He spoke of the love his sister had for Chris and the utter betrayal of that love. He described the horror of knowing how his nieces died at the hands of their own father, the man they adored. These statements were not just words. They were a testament to the immense void left behind, a portrait of the beautiful lives that had been so senselessly and cruelly extinguished. Throughout the emotional testimony, Chris Watts sat at the defense table, motionless and stone-faced. He wore an orange prison jumpsuit, his head bowed, refusing to make eye contact with the family whose lives he had shattered. He showed no flicker of emotion, no tear of remorse, as the raw pain of his victims' loved ones filled the courtroom. His silence was a final damning statement, a confirmation of the emotional void within him. He offered no apology, no explanation. He simply sat there, a hollowed-out shell of a man, as the weight of his crimes settled upon him for all the world to see. The judge, after listening to the statements, handed down the sentence. For the murders, Chris Watts received 3 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die in prison. He received an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 36 years for tampering with the bodies. The judge stated that it was the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever seen. With the gavel's fall, justice was served. Chris Watts would spend the rest of his days locked away from the world, a prisoner of his own making, haunted by the smiling faces of the family he chose to destroy for a fantasy that would never come true. The Watts family murders sent a shockwave across the country. The case dominated news cycles and social media, captivating a public that struggled to comprehend the unspeakable act. The story resonated deeply because it struck at the heart of our beliefs about family, trust, and safety. In Frederick, Colorado, the community reeled from the tragedy. The house on Saratoga Trail became a makeshift memorial. These memorials were a testament to the community's shared pain and a declaration that Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico would not be forgotten. Shanann's family, the Razucheks, channeled their grief into preserving the memory of their loved ones and became advocates for victims of domestic violence. Chris Watts became one of the most reviled figures in modern crime, a symbol of ultimate betrayal. The tragedy forced a difficult national conversation about domestic abuse and the facade of perfection in the age of social media. Years after the murders, the case of Chris Watts continues to haunt the public consciousness, raising difficult and enduring questions about the nature of evil. How does a man who, by all outward appearances, was a loving father and husband, transform into a cold-blooded family annihilator? What warning signs were missed? The case has become a subject of intense study by criminologists, psychologists, and armchair detectives alike, all searching for an explanation for his monstrous actions. The lack of a clear dramatic history of violence or abuse makes the case particularly chilling, suggesting a darkness that can fester silently beneath a placid surface. The role of social media in the tragedy remains a topic of intense debate. Shanann's prolific use of Facebook created a detailed public diary of her family's life, a narrative of happiness that stood in stark contrast to the private reality of her marriage. For many, the case highlighted the dangerous gap between online perception and offline reality. It served as a sobering reminder that the curated, picture-perfect lives we see on our screens are often just a carefully edited version of the truth. The illusion of the perfect family was so powerful that it made the eventual revelation of the horror all the more shocking and difficult to process. The story of Chris Watts has been immortalized in books, podcasts, and documentaries, including the widely watched Netflix film American Murder: The Family Next Door. This documentary, which used Shanann's own social media posts and police bodycam footage to tell the story, brought the tragedy to a new generation and a global audience. It provided an intimate first-hand look at the family's life and their tragic end, further cementing the case as a landmark in the true crime genre. The continued fascination ensures that the story and the questions it raises will not fade from memory anytime soon. Ultimately, the Watts family tragedy is a story without a satisfying answer. There is no explanation that can truly account for the depth of Chris Watts's depravity. We are left with the heartbreaking reality of 4 lives stolen, a family destroyed, and a community left with permanent scars. The case serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that evil can wear a smiling face, that darkness can hide in the most ordinary of places, and that the question of why will sometimes echo forever, unanswered. The story of Chris Watts is a cautionary tale that will be told for years to come, a testament to the ultimate betrayal and the devastating secrets that can lie behind closed doors. The story of Chris Watts defies easy explanation, a descent into darkness that challenges our understanding of human nature. It's a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not shadowy strangers, but those disguised as husbands, fathers, and friends. They smile for family photos moments before shattering lives. The tragedy of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico is more than a headline. It is a permanent scar. It forces us to confront the truth that we may never truly know what goes on behind closed doors. It peels back the veneer of suburban tranquility to reveal unimaginable horror. We grapple with how love can curdle into hatred, how a protector can become a predator. Evil can wear a smiling face and darkness can hide in familiar places. The story of Chris Watts reflects a capacity for betrayal so complete. The most dangerous secrets are the ones we keep from those we love the most, until it is far too late.